Her research has been published or is forthcoming in top journals like International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Peace Research, Journal of Communication Resolution, or sorry, Conflict Resolution, not communication, Journal of Global Security Studies, Journal of Strategic Security, Institute of Electronics, of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the Cyber Defense Review, and others. And her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation as well as the Belfer Center for Science and International Technology at Harvard. Next up is Gavin Wild. Mr. Gavin Wild is a senior fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., where he applies his expertise on Russia and information warfare to examine the strategic challenges posed by cyber and influence operations, propaganda, and emerging technologies. He's also an adjunct professor at the Alperovitch Institute for Cybersecurity Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. He previously served on the U.S. National Security Council as director for Russia, Baltic, and Caucasus Affairs. In addition to managing these country-specific portfolios, he helped craft policy on cyber, election security, and foreign malign influence issues. Gavin also served as a linguist, senior analyst, and organizational leader in the U.S. intelligence community for nearly 15 years, and he's a proud graduate of the University of Utah, where he received a BA in Russian and was later a distinguished graduate from the U.S. National War College with an MS degree in National Security Strategy. And then last but not least, we have Erica Lonergan, who is an assistant professor in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. She has held positions at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. These include serving as assistant professor in the Departments of Social Science and Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. She's been a fellow at the Army Cyber Institute and the executive director of the Rupert H. Johnson Grand Strategy Program. She's also held positions as a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and with the Atlantic Council. She has done various appointments related to policy work, including as a member of the Board of Visitors of the U.S. Army War College. She was a lead writer of the 2023 U.S. Department of Defense Cyber Strategy, as well as the congressionally mandated Department of Defense Cyber Posture Review. Prior to that, she served as a senior director on the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, a bipartisan congressional commission established to develop a new strategy and policies to defend the United States in cyberspace. She serves as a senior advisor to the Cyber Solarium Commission 2.0 and various other honors on here. Her most recent book is Escalation Dynamics in Cyberspace, which was recently published by Oxford University Press. So with that, let's go ahead and get into our discussion for today. So we're going to have a sort of a brief discussion, maybe until about 15 towards the end of the hour, till about 12:45, and then we'll kick it over to you all for questions and answers. So if you have questions that come up during our discussion, please note them down and be ready to jump in and ask those at the end. I hope you can see from the bios from our panelists that we have some really amazing people here who have really deep expertise on these issues. So please feel free to ask your questions and join in at the end while we have the amazing benefit of having these folks here. But let's start off by sort of clarifying a little bit more, both about what exactly it is we're talking about here when we're talking about cyber warfare, and in particular, you know, I've sort of provided information on your backgrounds generally and all of the great things that you've done, but I'm wondering if we can start out by having each of you talk a little bit about, number one, what does it you mean when you say cyber warfare or cyber conflict? Because sometimes that can be a very broad term, depending on who's using it. Other times it can be a very narrow term. Sometimes we just mean hacking and that's it. Sometimes it's very broad. It can mean everything from hacking all the way up to propaganda and disinformation as well. So I'd sort of like to hear from each of you, you know, how you think about cyber warfare and what the boundaries are of what we're talking about when we're talking about cyber warfare, and also what each of you have been working on specifically related to cyber in the Ukraine conflict. So maybe let's start at that end and move this way.
Okay.
Cool.
Sounds good. Well, first of all, thank you, Sean, so much for bringing us here, and to my panelists for joining me on this stage. I'm really excited to hear about the work they're working on, and also to hear from you all and hopefully answer your questions about this topic. And it's a great question to start us off with in terms of how do we conceptualize what cyber warfare means. I actually don't even like using the term cyber warfare. So let me just start off by challenging the premise of the question in the first place, but it's an important question. And that's because there are so many aspects of competition or conflict in cyberspace that don't resemble what we traditionally think about as being warfare, which is about physical destruction, to be quite frank about it, the killing of people and the breaking of things for political objectives. And it's a sacrosanct thing, right? Because it involves states and organized political actors, expending cost and blood and treasure to achieve political goals. And when we try to map those frameworks onto cyberspace, they fall short because the cyber domain, and even using the word domain is controversial, right? Because domain implies it's an operational environment where military organizations organize themselves and employ force and project power. Cyberspace is generally nonviolent, right? It's a digital environment where actors can, conduct hacking to steal information for the purposes of espionage or for economic benefit, to cause sort of disruption of things and functions that rely on information and communications technology, to maybe in rare cases have effects in the physical world, to conduct information operations, which I know we'll get into, but cyber doesn't fit neatly into warfare paradigms. But as all of us as being experts and scholars in international relations and security studies, we're tempted to kind of default to those prior framings, but that can shape how we do research and understand this domain. And I'll stop there because I know my colleagues will have many more thoughts to add to that topic, but I just would offer that as a word of caution. And also note that cyberspace, it's important to sort of define upfront what we're talking about when we talk about cyberspace, because it intersects with things like the information environment, information warfare, mis and disinformation. It intersects with electronic warfare, and so on and so forth. And so there isn't a wrong way of conceptualizing these concepts, but it's important for researchers and people who write on these issues to be clear upfront about what they mean when they say cyber operations, what they mean when they talk about information warfare or the relationship between cyberspace and the information environment. So with that kind of very general brush clearing, let me talk for a little bit about my research, and then I'll hand it over to Gavin. So I generally, philosophically come at this issue from a perspective of kind of skepticism about how much technology will change warfare, how much it will change strategic interactions between political actors. And so when Russia launched its invasion, its complete invasion 2 years ago, and Nadia has done a lot of work on the role of cyber operations in going all the way back to 2014, so I'm sure she could speak to that. But when Russia launched its invasion in 2022, there were all of these debates about whether it kind of resurfaced this kind of binary debate in the cyber field about whether this would be sort of the decisive moment to reveal the role of cyber operations in modern warfare, because finally we have this illustrative use case of major modern conventional land warfare, but with this cyber component. And so lots of people wrote about cyber shock and awe, about these kind of cataclysmic visions of the role that cyber operations would play in this conflict. And that's understandable because Russia is a highly prolific and capable nation-state actor in cyberspace. It has a long record of conducting disruptive and destructive cyber attacks against critical infrastructure and so on. And so it's all reasonable that some experts would fall along those lines. Others were a lot more skeptical and felt that this instance would not be revolutionary, perhaps evolutionary. I sort of fall in that kind of latter camp. And so what I decided to do, at the time I was a professor at West Point, I had some colleagues at Columbia, where I'm now in the faculty. We decided to sort of get together and collect data from publicly open source information about cyber incidents that were taking place in this conflict. Because unlike what you may hear from some who say that sort of cyberspace is secret and unknowable. There's actually a lot of information about the behavior of actors in cyberspace. And so we have been embarked on this 2-year project to collect data about cyber incidents in the context of this war, both Ukrainian aligned and Russian aligned. And our particular focus was to organize this data around understanding the relationship between the conflict taking place in the digital realm and the conflict taking place in the physical realm. And so I could talk more in further discussion in Q&A, but we've been sort of mapping the evolution of threat actors, the spread of the conflict, both within the theater of operations in Ukraine and sort of beyond it, trying to understand who the actors are they specializing in certain types of targets, are they focusing on critical infrastructure or not, what types of cyber operations are they conducting, is there any evidence of correlation between cyber incidents and battlefield dynamics, and so on. And so this is a multi-year effort. It's ongoing because the conflict is ongoing, but I'm really excited about this project and would be happy to talk more about it in Q&A, but let me turn it over to Gavin.
Well, similarly, this is a band that I have been a fan of for a lot of years, and so being able to sit up here with these two ladies and Sean, it's a real honor. I would say, as far as defining cyber warfare, I share Erica's I come at it from a bit more of a skeptical view, in that cyber warfare probably defined as a cyber operation designed to have an effect in and of itself, not to spy in order to kind of gain some kind of insight into your adversary, but to break something, to cut off some ability to communicate, to potentially even have a physical effect like turning out the lights, etc., in pursuit of some military objective. So in terms of this, the war in Ukraine, I think my focus for the last couple of years has been, as it was in my previous government experience, essentially trying to prove Russia wrong. Because Russia comes at cyberspace in a very different way than the United States does, in that they tend to think of it, I would say, from the cognitive or the psychological out, in contrast to the way the United States thinks about cyberspace in terms of networks in. And I'll kind of, Russia's historical strategic culture tends to be very, the way they think about information in the Kremlin in particular has long been one of conspiratorialism, this idea that there's no such occurrence in the physical space that isn't controlled, or that there are dynamics in the way that human beings and societies perceive events that can be somehow molded and controlled and shaped with some reasonable expectation of success in the outcome. And so particularly with this war, where so many of the cyber attacks have been focused not on achieving a discernible military outcome, or where some of the cyber operations that we have been able to see were less directed at preventing the Ukrainian armed forces from doing a specific thing on the battlefield, but were more dedicated towards demoralizing and immiserating Ukraine's civilian population in the anticipation that that morale hit would be somehow conclusive or lead to Ukraine's ultimate capitulation. In my most recent work, I kind of explore this dynamic and demonstrate, at least in the Ukrainian case, that not only was that approach not effective, but it in fact has backfired, particularly over the last decade, as Ukraine's kind of been pummeled with disruptive operations aimed at basically just demoralizing the civilian population, trying to get them to lose faith in their leadership in Kyiv, and ultimately trying to get the Kyiv political leadership to kind of capitulate ultimately. But as we've seen over the last 10 years, there's been this massive rally around the flag effect internally in Ukraine, even before the 2022 invasion. Ukraine's become a heavily digitized economy, heavily digitized population. Most of their government services are now moving online. The way that Ukrainian citizens interact with the state has become more kind of predictable and stable, and the digital interactions, whether you're renewing your driver's license, your passport, applying for social benefits, those interactions are now taking place over a smartphone in a way that in past decades they were taking place person to person, and where there was opportunity for corruption and graft that demoralized the civilians and made them feel that their government was corrupt and fueled so much distrust. Now that digitization effort has done a great deal to kind of invigorate Ukraine's own sense of what democracy means and what trust in government means. So I think broadly, this war has been an opportunity to kind of demonstrate the limitations of cyber operations in service of particularly combined arms military goals, where you're actually trying to integrate cyber operations with real-world conventional bombs and missiles and tank advances, et cetera. And that's just really, really hard to do. It's been hard for a long time for militaries of all stripes, but particularly for Russia, because of the way they think primarily in terms of cyber as a psychological tool and as a tool directed at civilian populations. And so by no means does that mean that the Russian forces aren't capable of learning and adapting, but I think ultimately what the conclusion I've recently come to is that it's also important that we accept and acknowledge that the targeted civilian populations themselves can adapt and evolve, and might also evolve and adapt in ways that are counterproductive to the attacker. And with that, I'll turn it to Nadia.
Great, thank you. And as everybody, I'll say honor is mine to sit with all of you. And also thank you so much for welcome and invitation. It's very excited to be here. And it's so beautiful. You guys are so lucky to be on this campus. It's amazing. So I'm not going to repeat, but I'm on the same sort of stand as Gavin and Sean and Erica about the cyber warfare. And Sean, as Sean mentioned, I started working on this topic in 2014. I started looking at the role of disruptive cyber operations that they play in the war in Ukraine. And very quickly, back then, I concluded that obviously they're not playing a major role. They're generally being used independently from conventional military operations because of a variety, a lot of reasons. One of them is this sort of synchronization challenge that Gavin pointed to. But also, when I was thinking sort of about this role of cyber in the modern warfare, I was also troubled with this sort of binary debate, right? Cyber matters, cyber doesn't matter, and everybody's like, oh, it doesn't matter because of X, Y, Z. But at the same time, we've seen that the internet, right, has been used in a lot of different capacity in a lot of different conflicts, right? Ukraine is one example. Israel, Gaza is another example. And so over the last 2 years, I evolved to started thinking about less of cyber war or cyber per se, but the role of the internet, right? And internet has a lot of layers. It has hardware layer, software layer, application or data layer. And I started wondering when a lot of different activities are taking place on each of these layers, and which of these activities different actors have been using and why, and whether they actually make a difference, right? So Gavin mentioned obviously that information warfare, which takes place on the application layer, has been sort of thriving and has been potentially shaping public opinion. And I'm not focusing on that per se, but obviously that's one aspect that sort of shows that is very, very important. And it can play and have an effect in modern warfare. When we talk about the disruptive usability of cyber attacks, yes, we also learned that they're not playing a major role, they're not substituting conventional military operations, etc. But I think it's important to start sort of figuring out, like, so many things can take place online, and actually which of them sort of take place when, and why actors keep using them if they have no value, right? So one example one project that I started working recently, I'm looking at when is it useful for the Russian government to disrupt internet service availability, right? To basically implement internet shutdowns in Ukraine. And so what I'm showing with a bunch of my co-authors on this project is that internet shutdowns, basically having no internet, is useful when there's a lot of intensive fighting, right? With this contested territory, disrupting communications of the military forces, also disruptive internet, limiting internet availability for the local population, so they cannot oppose the combatant operations, they cannot resist, is very, very useful. But those are useful only under very limited conditions, right? And as we can see from the case of Ukraine, is the Russian government in general keeps the internet up and running. And we know a lot of anecdotal examples why this is the case. Specifically at the beginning of the war, we've seen all this information from the public sources, right, that the Russian military has been using the Ukrainian internet even to, to navigate the Ukrainian territories, right? They have been using it for command and control, also obviously for the disinformation or propaganda purposes, etc. So what is surprising about all this, where something that sort of Sean started with, is that we identify very, very small conditions when disrupting internet is useful, but in general, keeping internet up and running and do a lot of different activities on it, including again disinformation, espionage, malware, etc., is more useful than taking the plug down. And one thing that I wanted to mention about this is that, again, as my thinking about the internet evolved, I also started working with a team of computer scientists, because I think this field obviously is sort of important in a sense that it's very interdisciplinary. It requires knowledge from different disciplines. And so for this particular project, I have been using internet traffic measurement and working with the computer scientists to see what is actually happening under the hood in this conflict, to try to identify those specific conditions.
Cool, that's awesome. Great. So I think each of you in your own way has sort of hinted at what we collectively maybe were told to expect, or maybe even did expect in some of our cases. I've been a huge critic of what I call cyber doom rhetoric, that we're going to have these massive cyber attacks that take down the power grid, and then it's going to be Lord of the Flies and chaos in the streets after that, right? And so a lot of my work has looked at the sort of rhetorical flourish that gets applied in this domain quite a lot. So, but even myself heading into this conflict, I was telling these guys before the panel started, and I mean, even for me, I was thinking okay, if we're ever going to see those kinds of really large, disruptive, perhaps even destructive cyber attacks, now's the time. This is when we're going to see it. I had my popcorn ready. I had all my news feeds and everything on all my screens going, waiting, and it didn't happen, right? So I guess I'd like to hear more of you say, each of you say more about what has happened. I mean, if those kinds of large-scale disruptive or destructive attacks that folks have expected for decades didn't happen in this context, then that sort of leaves me with a few questions. And that is, well, then why do we care about cyber? I mean, what has cyber actually accomplished that we can tell anyway during the conflict in Ukraine? And I think we're all in agreement that there's a lot of cyber happening, but it might not be what we expected to see. And so I guess the question is, what is really happening with cyber, and what implications is it actually having for the conflict? And what should we expect moving forward from cyber, both in the conflict in Ukraine, but also perhaps lessons that we can learn more broadly from Ukraine that might even be relevant to other conflicts that we might find ourselves involved with down the road, whether that's Russia, China, or we still have the ongoing conflict with Israel and Gaza, where cyber is playing a role there as well, including a few infrastructure attacks that have been reported. So so I guess that would be what I would throw to you all next. If we didn't see cyber doom in Ukraine, then why do we care? What is cyber even doing that is important, that we care about, and what lessons can we draw for the future of the Ukraine conflict, but conflict more generally in the role of cyber?
Yeah, I can start.
Go in the same order?
Yeah,
Or are we gonna go? Let's go back the other direction this time. Okay.
Let's see if I can handle it. I have 3-4 questions the way I wrote it. So frankly speaking, I was surprised that we started seeing all this rhetoric, right? And we've seen a lot of the rhetoric that, oh yeah, Russia just put troops on the border is not going to invade. Cyber will substitute this. This is not going to happen. And for me, I was like, okay, this conflict started. The first phase of this conflict started in 2014, and Russians has been doing a lot of this, sort of hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, whatever we call it, and it has been using a lot of cyber during the last, I guess, 8 years, right? During not 8 years, but the 8 years before it put the troops on the border. And if cyber could allow the Russians to achieve their objectives, it wouldn't spend all this effort to mobilize all these troops on the Ukrainian border, right? So I, frankly speaking, was very surprised to see all this cyber doom rhetoric similar to you. And then, of course, like when the conflict started, I personally also didn't expect that we're gonna see sort of scenes from the Hollywood movies that everything will be blown away and all of that stuff, right? So again, surprised to see more rhetoric as well, because of, again, if you already have military and the military is marching towards the capital, you can execute maybe a few of cyber attacks, but you have to be in the system. In order for you to have the position ready, it takes time, right? So you can do some of these, and we have seen some of these. There was a Viasat attacks on the satellite communications, which not achieved the, what they were hoping for, but they disrupted some of a little bit of the communications of the military command and control, right? So, but again, it cannot, you have to you have basically to get into new targets to be able to use them. And it's very, very difficult, especially to synchronize it with the military operations that are moving really faster. And specifically, if you attempt to destroy something, again, if you already have military options to do it, why wouldn't you just bomb something easily and just go, execute cyber attacks and then try to create some disruptions which might only last for a few hours, and then you can have systems back up working, right? So again, I didn't see, I was surprised to see a lot of this happening and a lot of rhetoric around this possibility, even, said by some of the even like senior officials from the administrations. But anyway, so going to the question, what cyber is good for, right? So what we have seen throughout this conflict is, right, we've seen some spikes in this sort of cyber disruptive, I would call them, operations. So we see at the beginning a little bit, then I think during the Ukrainian counteroffensive phase, basically in the fall, I think it was October and November. So basically what it shows us that in order for them to use this meaningfully, again, they need time to get into the target that could be of a specific value, right? Also, what we have seen is that there has been a lot of cyber, at least from public Microsoft reports, there has been a lot of cyber espionage that is happening, right? So what we see like triangulation, I would call it, approach, and not quote this on me on that because I just invented this term, but basically the use of military operations, cyber operations against the same target, right? So we see like, okay, military operations were approaching Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and then we see cyber espionage happening on the networks of the plant around the time as well, right? But also we see at the same time the disinformation, right? Information propaganda, different types of narratives started happening why Russia is doing that way, right? So there are three things that are usually they're trying to utilize, not all the time, but of a specific, when the operation carries specific value. Similarly, we have something like this happening last summer around the attacks against the grain, right? The grain shipment, grain deal, and all of that stuff. The effectiveness of this, I really don't know, because these are like individual things. And as I said, a lot of this happening on the sort of secrecy level, because there is a lot of information that has been collected and some of it has been used. Maybe potentially it shapes some of the battlefield events. But again, I am just a simple academic. I don't have access, unlike some other people on this panel, I don't have access to secret information, right? So I will need to wait and see when the information will become public to actually judge the value of the espionage information that has been collected on the battlefield, like short-term effect and potentially a long-term effect. But a lot of this has been happening. And so what do we expect? I would say we would expect similar things happening, similar things happening in other conflicts. But I think the key is also I think each case is unique, right? So if we think about the Israel-Hamas conflict, right, before the Israel invaded and around a lot of its military operations, Israel has the ability to turn off the internet in Gaza, right? The Russian and the internet structure is very, very different, right? The Ukrainian infrastructure is very decentralized. So if Russia used more internet outages, the impact would be much, much lower, right? So that's sort of type of things that we need to think about when we say how much of these techniques would translate into different questions. And the same thing when we think about China and Taiwan. Another thing that is also a striking for me about this conflict, and everybody, I guess, is aware of this, the role of non-state actors, the role of Microsoft, the role of these actors when in building resilience of the Ukrainian sort of defenses and everything. And of course, the biggest question is like, will all these companies help Taiwan if the conflict evolves, right? Will it be for free? Will it be, the same? Will it be not the same, etc. I think I'll leave it at there, and I'll let everybody else to add it to this.
So I think in terms of near misses, I want to footstop the role of there were some points in which I thought that there might be some consequential attacks, either cyber or physical, that would be kind of catastrophic. For instance, as the troops were amassing on the border in January and February, members of Amazon Web Services kind of flew into Kyiv and took, cooler-sized memory sticks, essentially called snowballs, and essentially downloaded everything that digitally, at least, makes Ukraine a state. Property records, education records, tax records, et cetera. Like, think of all that stuff that's just stored in digital space that we think about, financial records, ownership records. And they took them and they backed them up and flew them off to a safer place in Europe and back them up into the cloud, so to speak. Had Russia captured those either digitally or physically, that would have proven catastrophic. But again, Ukraine has also proven that even in a lot of these worst case instances where industrial control systems or critical infrastructure or power generation are hindered, there's a remarkable amount of resilience that comes into play, that when you're up against the wall, particularly as Ukraine is, when they feel like their very existence as a society and a state is up against the wall, you get really creative really quickly. And I think it's easy to underestimate how quickly we can bounce back and how instrumental the support from abroad has been. Russia could only dream of having the types of friends that Ukraine has in cyberspace right now. The other thing I would note, I just kind of being maybe a tad cheeky about the question of kind of what we can expect from Russia, I think, or why people do what they do in cyberspace. I think we underestimate the bureaucratic incentives. The Russian General Staff, Main Intelligence Directorate, or the GRU, needs to be seen doing something. Like there's obviously an imperative to achieve something on the battlefield or in Ukraine, but there's also a really, really keen need to be seen by their bosses in the Russian Security Council and in the Kremlin that we're actively engaged in doing something. This certainly came to a head, I think, in December when the GRU took down Kyivstar, which is essentially the Ukrainian analog to like Verizon, one of the biggest mobile providers in Ukraine. And that was, in terms of an intelligence service having the kind of access that the GRU apparently had for months, that's an intelligence gold mine. Now, to take down Kyivstar as they did in December, those dynamics are familiar to anyone who's worked in government. There's an intelligence gain-loss balance of when you break a network that you live in to look at but don't touch, you get kind of evacuated from that network and your access is gone. And so I think in everyone trying to look, including Ukrainian strategists, of like, what was the outcome of that? Why did they take down this network? They took down mobile connectivity for about 4 days and then everyone got back online gradually. But it was very difficult to see where the connectivity was from that attack to anything that happened in the real world. And a lot of folks were left wondering, was that merely the GRU simply being forced to attack a network that it owned for symbolic reasons, purely to demonstrate upchain that they are actively doing something in Ukraine. Particularly acute is the fact that given the manpower shortages that both Russia and Ukraine both experience on the ground right now, your alternative to appearing useful to your overseers as a young man behind the keyboard working for the GRU, your alternative to being seen doing something constructive might very well be being handed a gun and sent to the front. And so I think there's a lot of imperatives that we miss to conduct disruptive cyber operations that have little to do with actually anything on the ground in the conflict zone and more to do with simply being seen as a productive member of that kind of national security bureaucracy. So those are a couple notes that I would foot stomp.
Okay.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Gavin and Nadia have said, and let me just add a little bit to that. I think your point about resilience is so important. I think that stands out as this theme or an important lesson that a lot of experts have taken away from this conflict, both resilience from a cyber perspective, but also Ukraine's broader resilience and the Ukrainian population's resilience in the face of this war. But resilience is a really fuzzy term. It's something that, especially in the Beltway, practitioners like to talk about resilience, and the Defense Department likes to talk about resilience and its strategy. But a lot of this resilience kind of depended on, to your point about near misses, fortuitous decisions that aligned in the right way, right? So the decision by major American tech companies to get involved in enabling the cyber defense and resilience of Ukraine, that wasn't a foregone conclusion, right? The fact that Elon Musk and Starlink stepped in, right? So Viasat is a great example of a actually operationally successful cyber attack that affected Ukraine's communications capabilities, but ultimately Russia couldn't capitalize on that and have a broader strategic impact because of these other external variables, right? What is it? So, it raises these bigger questions in terms of implications for other crises and contingencies and conflicts as to how you actually build resilience and how you institutionalize it and what it means and how you measure it and how can you know with some measure of certainty or some acceptable calculation that that your society, that your military and so on will be resilient, because things could have gone in a very different type of direction depending on the decision making by third-party actors that are completely external to this war, right? And so to Nadia's point about Taiwan, thinking through, well, what will big tech do in a Taiwan contingency is a completely open question. And this is something the US government is really grappling with, something the Pentagon is grappling with, because they're realizing the dependence of Ukraine's military on Starlink is both an opportunity and a source of vulnerability, right? And so as the US government thinks about planning for the future, that's its relationship with the private sector, where many of these capabilities reside, is a big open question. In terms of why we care about cyber, this is like an existential question, right, for all of us, because this is our field, this is what puts food on the table for our kids, right? This is our life. I think that, and Nadia, you sort of alluded to this, we don't want to generalize. So this is just one case, right? And so it's important not to generalize from the current Ukraine conflict to make broader inferences about cyber and war writ large. And Gavin, you made this point too. Russia has a very unique strategic culture and doctrinal perspective on information warfare that's different from how the US thinks about it. And so, just because we're seeing things evolve in one way in this war doesn't mean that this is the one way that cyber plays a role in conflict. I think if you look at, for example, US cases, going back to the global war on terror and the early experimentation with cyber on the battlefield in Iraq in particular, it's a very different way of thinking about cyber that really grew out of kind of signals intelligence and targeting, where cyber is where the U.S. Does not come at it from a perspective of kind of the cognitive space, but rather very much a narrow technical perspective where cyber is used as an enabler of follow-on kinetic action. And so you saw this in Iraq with targeting, where cyber was useful for the location of locating insurgents and enabling follow-on strikes through drones or special forces raids, right? And then there's kind of this iterative cycle where collecting physical hardware and computers and so on from raids that happen in the physical space enables intelligence collection, right? So it's a much it's a very different perspective on cyber in war, and you saw that kind of get institutionalized with Operation Glowing Symphony in some ways. The U.S. Cyber component of the Operation Inherent Resolve, the U.S. effort to combat the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. There was a cyber component to it, and there's been a lot that's been publicly written and discussed about that operation in particular. It's a very different, it's a much more technocratic perspective on using cyber to degrade the Islamic State's ability to conduct command and control, recruit, spread propaganda, and so on. So it's almost an inverse of the starting point is completely inverted from the Russian starting point. And so I would just inject some element of caution about drawing broad inferences about this case. I would also say in terms of why we care about cyber, well, most of the time we're not at war, thankfully, right? And so there are a lot of reasons why cyber is a useful tool for states short of war. Conflict is an aberration, right? It's not the norm. And cyber has a number of unique characteristics that make it useful for states in times of crisis, right? We see this with the current crisis between the U.S. and Iran. There's been, the U.S. government has acknowledged conducting cyber operations to against Iranian computers to degrade their ability to carry out certain types of operations. Cyber has an element of stealth and deception, and so much of modern life depends on the internet and information and communications technology that sometimes cyber is the only way to get at the objective you want to achieve. And these are all things that happen short of war, right? And certainly there's the espionage value of cyberspace. So just because we're not seeing the cyber bombs and the cyber shock and awe that some more hyperbolic commentators may have expected in the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, doesn't mean that cyber isn't a tool of geopolitics and a tool of military organizations too. It just may not manifest in the way that, that some experts think. So I think those are all my thoughts. Yeah.
All of them. That's it.
All of them. I have no more thoughts.
We've reached the end.
We've
of
reached
the
the end of
internet
my
and
yeah,
the end of
yeah.
Erica's thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hopefully you still have a few thoughts left because I'm sure there are folks in the audience that have some questions or some comments. So let's go ahead and take the last 10 minutes here and get some questions and comments from folks in the room.
Okay, so while each of you have written before the war and during the war about what to expect with cyber war and Ukraine as a whole, I was wondering if we could talk about after the war. Many of the articles that I've read in class and out of class point toward a future of successful, similar to South Korea for Ukraine. And the Carnegie handout talks about how it's more akin to Estonia. So where do you see a successful future for Ukraine going?
You want to start since it's your,
Yeah.
they cite you?
Yeah.
So I think, at least in the Ukraine instance, but probably similar to South Korea, so much, as Erica points out, depends on the value of partnerships between, supporting states, but also, let's be honest, Ukraine right now has a strong market pull for cybersecurity and technology companies because they are trying to make digital connectivity the cornerstone of their kind of post-war reconstruction. And so I think there's a valid long-term strategy for a lot of companies thinking about technology for commercial use or for national security use. I think Ukraine's going to be a great place for folks to set up shop to both capitalize on those dynamics and study them. But I think, again, a lot of that will depend on the degree of support that it gets right now from particularly the United States, because in terms of preventing this war from getting worse in the short term, there's not many other players that have the kind of heft that the United States does in providing the physical capacity that Ukraine needs to stave Russia off.
Yeah, I would totally agree with this. So I'm originally from Ukraine, moved here many years ago, but you still have a lot of relatives there, but even like going back a few years before the war, like everybody used internet just for social media, right? Facebook, Contacte, various things. Even if we talk about, like online banking, it wasn't a thing. And then all of a sudden, since this war, this DIA platform and a lot of different things, I was just like, I was amazed and impressed how many people use internet. Not only just young generations, but my aunt and grandmother, they can transfer money using their phone. I was just like, wow, it like blows my mind, right? So it happens so quickly, and again with the support, outside support, but also a lot of education and advertising how to do this. I'm just like being maybe very radical over here, but if I were back, in Ukraine, I think like we do have a lot of very talented computer scientists, and obviously this war is a horrible experience. So I would potentially create something like Unit 8200, like in Israel, to capitalize both experience, right? They have really valuable war experience, but also you have a lot of computer scientists. In addition to the commercial aspect, I think we could do something similar like this, right? Recruit kids from, I don't know, I'm not saying to make mandatory military service or anything like this, but like recruit kids early on so they have this option. And we do have some sort of experimentations with startups, but they're not obviously as successful as the Israeli ones. But I think, again, this experience put people through a lot and they see this value. So I think, again, if I were back there, I would potentially, wouldn't be surprised if the government would move in that direction as well.
We have a question from the online audience. Why and how do geopolitical alliances and partnerships impact the dynamics of cyber warfare in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
What is the question? How is geopolitical
Can you
partnership?
repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, geopolitical partnership.
Why do geopolitical alliances and partnerships impact the dynamics of cyber warfare in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, let me weigh in with some initial thoughts. It's a great question. I think let me speak to this from the NATO perspective, right? Because I think that offers. I think when we tend to think about geopolitical relationships and partnerships, NATO is one of those kind of preeminent alliances that we tend to think about. And I'm not sure if this directly addresses the problem, but like. Cyber has been a longstanding concern of the NATO alliance for many, many years. The alliance agreed that cyberspace was a domain of warfare. I think at the Wales Summit in 2015? Yeah. Anyway, and many of the reactions of the NATO alliance to cyber have been as a result of Russian activity, right? So the original decision to establish a cyber center of excellence in Tallinn, Estonia, was in response to Russia's cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007. And then again, the experience in 2008 with Georgia continued to shape NATO strategy and policy and doctrine. And so I think that when it comes to the current conflict in Ukraine, you saw NATO leaders, and there were official NATO communiques, member state leaders of heads of state and government for NATO members and NATO leaders themselves making these pretty strong declarations reaffirming NATO policy that Article 5, the collective defense provision of NATO, applies to cyberspace, issuing what were deterrent threats to Russia to attempt to dissuade Russia from conducting cyber attacks against NATO member states in the context of this war. And nevertheless, you've seen the spread of the conflict in cyberspace at a much lower threshold, but still beyond Ukraine to affect NATO member states, including the United States, especially the Baltic states. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia have been hit by pretty, not destructive, but like pretty significant, longstanding disruptive cyber attacks that are aligned with Russian actors. And so this is kind of a long-winded way of saying that, cyberspace and geopolitics can't be separated from one another, and you see alliances, including formal treaty allies like NATO, react to and grapple with the expression of geopolitics in cyberspace. And so, I don't know if that completely answers the question, but I think that we're seeing, just as NATO is struggling with how to defend Ukraine and the broader implications of Russian aggression in Ukraine and what that might mean for the alliance and the integrity of the alliance going forward, we're also seeing those questions reprised in a cyber context. And so these are all sort of related issues.
Unless you two have anything on that one, we probably have time for one more audience question before this.
My question was, you talked a lot about how the Russian style of cyber warfare has been just very ineffective, yet they continue to do it. Has there been any positives that has led them to be like, it's good enough to keep doing it, or have they just been throwing it at a wall and it just keeps coming back? Is there any positives to their style of cyber warfare?
So at least more recently, it sounds like there's reports that cyber troops have been embedded further into the conflict with
Frontline.
unit-level troops, so that when, for instance, they capture a piece of hardware, they can try and reverse engineer it. They can try and do attacks at a more localized level that exists on the battlefield. And in my estimation, that's positive for all militaries. I think that one of the thrusts of my research is that it's better to fail repeatedly at the attempt to do militarily relevant cyber attacks and operations than to succeed often at basically shutting off the lights and being disruptive to civilians that are far, far from the battlefield, because obviously, from a territorial gains perspective, it's going to mean more. So I think from that perspective, Russia's gotten better. From the perspective of electronic warfare, which a lot of folks sometimes mix in with cyber warfare, which is essentially you're jamming the spectrum so that radio waves can't kind of guide drones or a lot of that type of stuff. Russia's gotten better at deploying units that are very capable of electronic warfare. So I think they are learning and adapting, but I think more broadly, for both Russia and any military that hopes to integrate cyber operations as part of a combined arms conventional way of warfare, it remains to be seen whether there's just a ceiling beyond which no one can kind of exceed at doing it well. Lennart Maschmeyer calls it the trilemma that you face. Cyber operations, you need speed to do it quickly, you need control so that it does only the thing that you asked it to do, and you need impact, which means like it absolutely has an impact on the battlefield. But the problem is, in servicing one of those, you lose out on the other two. So it's hard to generate good, effective cyber operations at the speed of a real war. And so what you've seen in the last several months is just a lot of wiper attacks where the GRU just kind of whatever networks it can access, it just tries to wipe all the data. Now again, it's disruptive, but to me it at least signals that they don't have a lot of really sophisticated exploits left in their arsenal to throw. And so there's just kind of a spray and pray attempt. But again, time will tell whether they can come up with something more impactful.
Yeah, can I add to this? Sure. Yeah, to add to this also, I really like to see that development as well in the front line. But I think also what they do in a smart way, and I'm not, we'll see how much effect it has, but they solidify the control of the territory and then they reroute traffic, right? We've seen it happening in Kherson, in Zaporizhia. So they will obviously they are not rerouting traffic in the western part of Ukraine because, of course, you know, it's difficult. There's no value, but they know that in southern eastern part of Ukraine, you know, they can still shape minds of the people who are they, you know, hoping to get sort of the territories they're hoping to get to obtain the control of, like, long term. So you can see a lot of different tactics being implemented depending on which part of this conflict we are talking about, and I think it's again, maybe it's not as effective, but they are adjusting, and I think that's interesting how much they have evolved comparing what they have been doing in 2014. Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Erica? Or?
No, I was going to make the comment about occupied Ukraine, so Nadia.
Yeah,
Nadia,
no.
she's got it.
All right. Cool. Well, with that, I think we are right at 1 o'clock, so it's probably time to end. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to Hinckley for partnering with us to put this event on. They've been excellent hosts. And thank you to everyone on the live stream who's been watching. And I will remind all of you who are in the room, there's pizza, or hopefully there's still pizza. Grab some on your way out. And if there are any copies left of Gavin's most recent report on Russian cyber, you can grab one of those on your way out as well. Okay, so thank you all.